Welcome to Dusky Lore. Close your eyes, dim the lights, and listen closely as the shadows begin to speak. Story 1. I worked as a backcountry ranger in Yellowstone National Park for 11 years. In all that time, I responded to countless emergencies, the kind most people only know about from news headlines. I performed cardiopulmonary resuscitation on tourists who suffered heart attacks from the altitude. I documented bear attacks where grizzlies defended their territory against hikers who got too close. I stood at the edge of thermal pools where visitors slipped on wet boardwalks and fell into water hot enough to break down human tissue in a matter of minutes. Once I spent 3 days searching for a man who wandered away from his family at Old Faithful and was later found dead from exposure in a snow-covered ravine. I also witnessed a suicide at the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, where a young man climbed over the safety railing and jumped 300 feet down to the river below. All of those experiences hardened me. They taught me that nature does not care about human life, and that tragedies in wild places rarely resemble the clean, softened versions shown in visitor safety videos. But none of my training, none of my years of experience, none of the countless emergency response scenarios I had practiced prepared me for what I discovered at Pelican Creek during the summer of 2019. It was early June, just after the spring thaw, when permits began being issued for camping in the park's most remote regions. The days were long and warm, but the nights still dropped below freezing in the higher elevations. That was the season when the most experienced backpackers ventured deep into areas that might receive barely a dozen visitors in an entire year. Pelican Creek is one of those areas. It lies in the northeastern section of the park and can only be reached after a grueling 7-mile hike from the nearest trailhead. There are no maintained trails beyond the first 2 miles. Navigating there requires map and compass skills that most casual hikers do not have. The terrain is unforgiving. Dense lodgepole pine forests give way to swampy meadows where you can sink into the mud up to your knees. Grizzly bears are common. Cell phone signal does not exist. It is the kind of place where if something goes wrong, you are completely alone until someone realizes you have disappeared. And that can take days. The call came over my radio at 6:30 in the morning. Dispatch informed me that a day hiker had reported finding an abandoned campsite near Pelican Creek. According to the hiker, the tent was still standing. The bear canister was full of food, and camping gear was scattered around the site, as if the person occupying it had vanished in the middle of a meal. It was concerning, but not unprecedented. Sometimes campers panic because of animal activity and abandon their gear in order to get out faster. Sometimes they get injured and leave everything behind to search for help. I grabbed my pack, loaded it with medical supplies and emergency communication equipment, and began the hike at dawn. The trail was muddy from recent rain. I moved quickly, covering the first 4 miles in just over an hour. The forest was silent, except for the occasional caw of a raven and the distant sound of Pelican Creek, swollen from the snowmelt. As I approached the reported coordinates, I began looking for signs of bear activity. Fresh scat, torn logs, claw marks on trees. If a bear had raided the campsite, there should have been evidence, but I saw nothing. The forest felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. I have spent enough time in remote areas to trust that instinct. When nature goes silent, something is out of place. I found the campsite exactly where the hiker had marked it on his GPS. The tent was a high-end mountaineering model, expensive and well-maintained. It was properly staked down, and the rainfly was tight. But the rear panel of the tent had been cut open, not torn by an animal. Cut. It was a clean vertical opening about 3 feet long, made with a sharp blade. I knelt and examined the edges of the cut fabric. The slash was deliberate and precise. A bear had not done that. It was not an accident. Someone had taken a knife and methodically opened the back of that tent from the outside. Inside the tent, I found a sleeping bag spread out. There was blood on the pillow. It was not a large amount, but it was enough to indicate a nosebleed or a minor head wound. The occupant's headlamp was still hanging from the roof of the tent. A book lay open on the sleeping pad. Whoever had been there had left in a hurry or had been forced out. I backed away carefully, trying not to disturb possible evidence, and began a wider search of the area. 50 feet from the tent, I found a day pack hanging from a branch, properly suspended as bear protection. Inside were a wallet, car keys, and a phone with a dead battery. The wallet belonged to a woman named Sarah Chen, 29 years old, with a California driver's license. I radioed the information to dispatch and continued searching. The next discovery made my stomach tighten. 2 miles east of the first campsite, I found another abandoned tent. This one was older, a budget model that had already seen better days. It also had a clean cut across the rear panel. The sleeping bag inside had what appeared to be dried blood on the outside. The camp stove was cold, but it had been used recently. I found a permit tag tied to a nearby tree. That campsite had been assigned to a woman named Jessica Ramirez 3 weeks earlier. She had filed a 5-day solo hiking itinerary. According to the permit records, she had exited the park on time and driven away. Or at least someone using her vehicle had left the park. By that point, I was operating under the assumption that I was looking at a crime scene. Multiple crime scenes. I radioed for backup and began documenting everything with my camera. That was when I noticed the hide in the trees, about 200 yards from the second campsite. Someone had built a small platform between 2 pine trees, about 15 feet up. It was extremely well hidden and would have been invisible to anyone who was not actively searching the area. I climbed carefully and found a waterproof ammunition box secured to the platform. Inside were photographs, hundreds of photographs, all of women hikers walking alone on trails, women setting up tents, women filtering water from streams, women sleeping inside their tents, photographed through the mesh doors with a telephoto lens. Some photos had handwritten notes on the back, dates, locations, physical descriptions. One photograph showed Sarah Chen at her campsite the day before I found it. Another showed Jessica Ramirez on the trail 3 weeks earlier. But there were more. Women I did not recognize. Women whose faces I had never seen in missing person reports. How many more had there been? My hands were shaking when I contacted dispatch again. I gave the GPS coordinates and requested an immediate law enforcement response, as well as helicopter evacuation for the evidence. They told me to secure the scene and wait. But I could not wait, because just as I was climbing down from the tree platform, my radio died. It did not run low on battery. It did not lose signal. It simply died. The screen went completely black and would not turn back on. I checked my backup handheld radio. Same thing. Both devices, fully charged that morning, had become completely useless. I was 7 miles from the trailhead, with no communication, and with a growing certainty that I was not alone. The footsteps began about 5 minutes later. Soft, deliberate. Someone was walking slowly through the forest about 50 yards to the west, moving parallel to my position. I stood completely still and listened. The footsteps stopped when I stopped. When I moved, they moved. I was being followed. I have encountered countless wild animals in the park's interior, and I know how they move. This was not an animal. It was a person matching my pace and staying just outside my line of sight. I pulled my bear spray from its holster and started moving toward the main trail as quickly as I could without running. Running would have revealed fear. Running would have made me pray. The presence stayed with me for another 10 minutes. Then the footsteps came closer. I turned and saw him. A man maybe in his 40s dressed in hiking clothes that were too clean for someone who had spent time in the backcountry. He carried a coil of climbing rope over one shoulder and a large fixed-blade hunting knife on his belt. His face was calm, too calm. I recognized him immediately. I had seen him several times at the ranger station permit office over the past 2 years. He was a frequent visitor who always requested backcountry permits. He always hiked alone. He always smiled and made casual comments about the weather and trail conditions. I had never thought twice about him. He stopped about 20 feet from me and smiled with that same friendly smile. He said, "Ashton, I know your name from your uniform. You've been looking at my work." His voice was casual, as if we had run into each other by chance in a coffee shop. I kept my hand on the bear spray and told him I needed him to stay where he was. He laughed. It was not a threatening laugh, just amused. He said, "You can't stop this with bear spray, Ashton, and your radios don't work here. I made sure of that." He raised a small electronic device I did not recognize, some kind of signal jammer. I asked him what he wanted. He tilted his head and seemed to consider the question. Then he said, "I've been collecting from women who camp alone. They come here thinking they're safe, believing the only dangers are bears and bad weather. But they're wrong. The real danger is people like me, people who know how to move through these woods without leaving tracks. I've been doing this for 3 years. You found Sarah and you found Jessica, but you haven't found the others." I felt my blood turn cold. I asked him how many more. His smile widened and he answered, 3 confirmed. 4 if you count the one from last season, the one who fell into a thermal pool after I chased her there. That one was classified as an accident." He began walking slowly toward me. I raised the bear spray and ordered him to stop or I would use it. He stopped but kept talking. "I'll tell you where they're buried, Ashton. I'll tell you everything because I'm done. This is the end game. You found my hide. You found my photographs. The police will arrive soon, even if your radios are blocked. I knew this day would come sooner or later." He reached into the pocket of his jacket, and I tensed, ready to fire the spray. But he pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He dropped it on the ground between us and stepped back 3 paces. 3 locations, GPS coordinates. You'll find remains at all 3. Near Heart Lake, near Shoshone Lake, near Thoroughfare. All solo hikers. All reported as accidental deaths or voluntary disappearances. No one suspected murder because no one expects a predator in a place like this. I did not move to pick up the paper. I asked him why he was telling me all of that. He said, "Because I want you to know that I won. For 3 years I hunted in the most famous wilderness area in America and no one noticed. And when they finally do notice, I'll be famous. They'll make documentaries about me. The Yellowstone predator. Sounds good, doesn't it?" He was insane, completely detached from reality. I needed to keep him talking until help arrived. I asked him why he had chosen this park. He answered, "Because it's easy. Millions of visitors every year. Thousands of miles of remote territory. Solo hikers are common. When someone disappears, everyone assumes it was nature. A bear attack, a fall, hypothermia. No one looks for a man with a knife." Then I heard it. The distant sound of helicopter rotors. My emergency beacon. I had activated it before my radios died, and in the chaos of the confrontation I had forgotten about it. The sound grew louder. The man heard it too. His expression changed from calm to rage. He looked at me and said, "You activated a beacon." It was not a question. I nodded. He looked toward the sky where the helicopter was approaching, and then looked back at me. For a moment I thought he was going to charge at me, But instead he turned and ran into the forest, cutting through the brush like a cornered animal. The helicopter landed in a nearby meadow 10 minutes later. I guided the team to the site and gave a full report. A massive search operation was launched. They found him 16 hours later, hiding in a drainage culvert near the park's east entrance. He had tried to hike out through 30 miles of wilderness, but he became disoriented. When they searched his vehicle, they found journals, detailed journals describing 12 potential victims he had been watching, maps with campsites marked, lists of names and dates. They found remains in 3 of the 4 locations he had described: Sarah Chen, Jessica Ramirez, and 2 other women who had been listed as missing persons in 2017 and 2018. The 4th location, near the thermal pool, yielded nothing. The acidic water had dissolved everything. I transferred to another ranger station 6 months after the trial concluded. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But I can no longer patrol the backcountry. Every time I see a woman walking alone on a remote trail, I think about the ones we did not find in time. I think about how easily evil can hide in a place people associate with natural beauty. And I think about the fact that for 3 years a predator walked among us with a smile on his face and a permit in his hand, and none of us knew. Nature does not care whether you live or die, but at least nature is honest about its dangers. The real horror is that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the forest is not the wildlife, it is other people. Story 2. I do not believe in ghosts. Or rather, I did not believe in ghosts until my 3rd season patrolling the thoroughfare region of Yellowstone National Park. Thoroughfare is not a place casual visitors ever get to see. It exists in the far southeastern corner of the park, where Wyoming borders the Teton Wilderness. If you stand at certain points along the Yellowstone River in that area, you are farther from a road than anywhere else in the contiguous 48 states of the United States. It is 32 miles to the nearest trailhead. There are no cell phone towers. There are no ranger stations. There are no emergency services within less than a full day's hike. When you patrol thoroughfare, you accept that you are truly alone. Or at least that was what I believed before the summer of 2017. My name is Quinn. I have worked for the National Park Service for 8 years, and I specifically requested assignment to remote backcountry patrols because I prefer solitude to the chaos of areas crowded with tourists. I am comfortable with isolation. I grew up in rural Alaska, where the nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and winter darkness lasted 19 hours a day. Silence does not make me uneasy. Empty wilderness does not frighten me. I have spent weeks alone in grizzly bear territory without experiencing anything that could be called fear. But what happened during those August nights in thoroughfare changed something fundamental in the way I understand the world. It forced me to accept that there are phenomena that cannot be explained with training manuals or rational thought. The first incident occurred on August 9th. I was conducting a standard 5-day patrol route that would take me through the southern part of the thoroughfare backcountry. My route included checking several designated campsites to make sure park regulations were being followed and to monitor wildlife activity. The weather had been clear for 3 days, and I was making good time. I reached the upper Yellowstone River Valley around 4 in the afternoon and decided to inspect a campsite located on a small promontory overlooking the river. That particular site is almost never used because reaching it requires fording the river twice. Most backpackers choose easier routes. As I approached the site, I noticed smoke immediately. There was a fire burning in the fire ring. That was strange for several reasons. First, no permit had been issued for that campsite in more than 2 weeks. I had checked the permit log before leaving on patrol. Second, the fire was burning cleanly, but no one was watching it. Third, there was no tent, no backpack, and no camping gear of any kind in sight. Just a burning fire, completely alone in the middle of the wilderness. I approached cautiously, scanning the surrounding forest for whoever might have lit the fire. The area was silent, except for the sound of the river and the crackle of burning wood. I called out to get someone's attention. There was no answer. I walked in a full circle around the perimeter of the campsite. There was no tent. There was no food cache. There was no sign of human presence except for the fire. Then I saw the boot prints, fresh tracks in the soft dirt around the fire ring. They were large, probably from men's size 11 or 12 hiking boots. The footprints circled the fire several times and then moved away from the campsite to the north, toward a dense stand of lodgepole pines. I followed them for about 50 yards until they simply stopped. Not on a rocky outcrop where the tracks could have been lost. Not at the river, where someone could have crossed the water. They simply ended in the middle of a game trail, as if the person had evaporated mid-step. I returned to the campsite and put out the fire. It had been burning strongly and was recent. The embers were still glowing red beneath the ash. I estimated it had been lit within the past 2 hours. I left a violation notice at the site for illegal camping without a permit and continued my patrol. I assumed I would find the mysterious campers somewhere farther along the trail. Maybe they had wandered off to explore or relieve themselves and would return to find the fire extinguished and the citation waiting for them. It was a violation of the rules, but not something particularly alarming. Sometimes people break regulations in remote areas, believing no one will notice. The next morning, I broke camp at dawn and continued north along the river. Around noon, I reached another designated campsite, approximately 8 miles beyond the first site. When I crested the small rise leading to the area, I stopped. Smoke. Another fire burning alone with no visible camp. That was no longer a coincidence. It was intentional. Someone was following me or getting ahead of me, lighting fires at every campsite along my route. I approached carefully, my hand on the bear spray. Once again, I called out loudly. Once again, I received no answer. The fire was fresh and burning intensely. The same boot prints circled the fire ring. The same footprints led into the forest and stopped abruptly 40 yards from the campsite. I contacted dispatch by radio. I reported the situation and asked for information about any other rangers or park personnel who might be in the area. Dispatch confirmed that I was the only authorized person in that section of the park. They checked for research permits or wildlife monitoring teams. Nothing. They instructed me to continue documenting the incidents and to report any contact with the individual responsible. I extinguished the second fire, photographed the footprints, and kept going, but I no longer felt comfortable. There was something about the precision with which the tracks ended in impossible places that deeply disturbed me. I have tracked animals and humans for years. Footprints do not simply disappear unless someone is deliberately erasing them, but there was no evidence of that. There were no swept marks. There were no signs that someone had carefully stepped under rocks, only footprints that stopped as if the person had been lifted off the ground. That night, I set up camp at an off-trail location about 3 miles north of the second fire site. I did not use a designated campsite. I wanted to be somewhere unpredictable in case someone was following me. I pitched my tent in a small clearing surrounded by a thick forest. I ate cold because I did not want to build a fire and reveal my location. As darkness fell, I sat outside the tent and watched the stars appear over the mountains. The Milky Way shone brightly in that sky free of light pollution. I felt that familiar peace that comes when you are far from civilization. But that peace did not last. At 3:47 in the morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps circling my campsite. I stayed completely still and listened. They were heavy steps. Boots, not animal paws. They moved around my tent in a clockwise direction, stopping every so often, as if the person was examining something. I slowly reached for my headlamp and bear spray. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was outside might hear it. The footsteps completed one full circle and then stopped directly in front of the entrance to my tent. Through the fabric illuminated by moonlight, I could see the shadow of a person, a tall figure standing motionless. I shouted, "I am a national park ranger. Identify yourself." There was no answer. The shadow did not move. I quickly unzipped the tent and aimed my headlamp at the figure. Nothing. There was no one there. I jumped out of the tent and swept the entire campsite with the light. Empty. The forest was silent. There were not even the usual nighttime sounds of birds or small mammals. Only absolute silence. I checked the ground around my tent. Boot prints. The same size 11 or 12 tracks I had seen at the 2 fire sites. They circled my tent twice and then led away into the forest. I followed them with my headlamp. 20 feet from my tent, they stopped. Just like before, they ended mid-stride on flat ground with no explanation at all. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. I sat with my back against a tree facing my tent, with bear spray in one hand and the satellite communicator in the other. I considered activating the emergency beacon, but I had no concrete physical threat to report. Only footprints and a shadow. At dawn, I packed my gear and continued north at a fast pace. I wanted to get out of Thoroughfare. I wanted to reach the trailhead and file a formal incident report with details that made sense. But the incidents were not over. On the 4th night of my patrol, I camped at an official site near the southern boundary of the Thoroughfare region. I was exhausted from 3 nights of minimal sleep and constant hypervigilance. I fell asleep around 9 at night despite my anxiety. I woke at 2:30 in the morning to orange light flickering against the walls of my tent. Fire. I rushed outside, expecting to find my campsite burning, but it was not my fire ring that was burning. About 100 yards away, down a slope near the river, another fire glowed brightly. I could see the flames clearly between the trees, and I could see a figure sitting beside it. A person sitting completely still, with their back to me, looking toward the river. I grabbed my flashlight and began moving down the slope. As I got closer, I could make out more details. The person was wearing dark clothing. They were sitting on the ground, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them, head bowed. They did not react to the sound of my footsteps. When I was about 30 feet away, I called out, "Park Service, I need to speak with you." There was no answer, no movement. I moved closer, 20 feet, 10 feet. Then I was close enough to see that the person was wearing an old ranger uniform, the kind that had not been issued since the 1960s or 1970s. Dark green wool with a campaign hat placed on the ground beside them. I stopped. Something was deeply wrong. The air around the fire felt cold despite the heat of the flames. My breath formed visible clouds. I said, "Sir, I need you to respond." The figure slowly lifted its head and turned to look at me. I will never forget what I saw. It was not a face, or rather it was a face, but it was wrong. The features were blurred, as if I were looking at someone through frosted glass. The eyes were dark voids. The mouth did not move, but I heard a voice. It did not come from the figure. It came from everywhere at once. A whisper that filled the forest. This is where it happened. I ran. I am not proud to say it, but I ran. I climbed back up the slope to my camp, threw my gear into my pack without bothering to properly take down the tent, and began walking north in complete darkness. I used my headlamp and moved as fast as the terrain allowed. I did not look back. I walked for 6 straight hours until dawn, and then I kept walking. I reached the trailhead 14 hours later, much earlier than planned in my itinerary. I was scratched, exhausted, and probably dehydrated, but I was out. I filed an incident report that I knew sounded absurd. I reported the fires, the footprints, and the figure beside the river. My supervisor listened without interrupting me, and then asked if I had been experiencing any health issues or side effects from medication. I understood what he was really asking. Was I going through a mental health crisis? Had I been hallucinating? I told him I was physically fine and that I knew exactly how my report sounded. He ordered me to take a week off and follow up with the park psychologist. I agreed because I wanted answers just as much as he did. During that week, I investigated. I accessed historical park records dating back to the 1960s. I found an incident from August 1964. A ranger named Thomas McKinley had drowned while attempting to ford the Yellowstone River in the thoroughfare region. His body was recovered 3 miles downstream from his last known campsite. The recovery team found his gear still at the campsite, with a fire burning in the fire ring. According to the report, McKinley had been camping alone and had left his site to cross the river at night for unknown reasons. His body was found wearing the uniform of the era, dark green wool. The report included a photograph. I recognized the face, despite how blurred I had seen it that night. It was the same person. I returned to work after my week off, but requested reassignment to another patrol area. My supervisor approved it without asking questions. I think he felt relieved. But before I left, I quietly spoke with 2 other veteran rangers who had worked in thoroughfare for years. I asked them if they had ever experienced anything strange in that region. Both of them became uncomfortable. One of them told me that every ranger who works that area long enough eventually sees the fires. They appear every year on August 12th, the date of McKinley's drowning. No one investigates them anymore. No one goes down to see who is sitting beside them. There is an unspoken understanding that some patrols are better left incomplete. I no longer work in thoroughfare. I patrol other regions of Yellowstone, where the strange is limited to wildlife and weather. But I know the fires still light every August. I know the footprints still appear, circling campsites in impossible patterns. And I know Ranger McKinley is still out there, sitting beside his fire, waiting for someone to understand what happened. I do not want to be that person. I have accepted that there are places in this park where the dead do not rest, and I am content to let them continue their vigil undisturbed. Story 3. The thermal basin near Norris Geyser should have been empty. It was February. Temperatures had dropped to 20 degrees below zero, and no winter camping permits had been issued for that remote area in 3 weeks. The area was officially closed to overnight stays from November through April because of the instability of the thermal formations and the extreme weather conditions. So when our helicopter pilot radioed that he had seen smoke rising from the restricted zone during a routine flyover, we knew immediately that something was very wrong. My name is Declan. I have been a law enforcement ranger in Yellowstone for 6 years, and in that time I have dealt with practically every imaginable type of permit violation. Tourists who ignore trail closures to get closer to bison, hikers who camp illegally in thermal areas and end up with third-degree burns, people who drive off authorized roads or vandalize geothermal formations. Most of those violations come from ignorance or arrogance, but what we found in Norris Basin that February was neither of those things. It was something much stranger, and far more disturbing than anything my training had prepared me for. I was assigned to the investigation along with another ranger named Foster. We loaded our gear into our packs and began the approach on skis at first light the following morning. The plan was to ski 9 miles into the closed area, document the illegal camp, issue the appropriate citations, and escort whoever was there back to civilization. The temperature was brutal. With the wind chill, it was 35 degrees below zero. That kind of cold burns exposed skin in a matter of minutes and turns your breath into ice crystals suspended in the air. No rational person would choose to camp in those conditions. That should have been our first warning that we were not dealing with rational people. The ski route took us 4 hours through deep snow and frozen streams. The landscape looked otherworldly. Steam from the thermal vents rose into the frozen air, forming columns of mist that glowed orange beneath the low winter sun. The ground under our feet was a mosaic of snow and bare earth, where underground heat kept the surface above freezing. In the distance, the roars and hisses of geysers could be heard. The smell of sulfur permeated everything in that part of the park. As we approached the coordinates marked by the pilot, we began seeing tracks, ski tracks, several sets arriving from different directions, all converging on the same point. We climbed a small rise and looked down into a shallow basin dominated by a large boiling mud pot. What we saw made both of us stop. 7 tents were arranged in a perfect circle around the mud pit. Each tent stood exactly the same distance from the center. The precision was unsettling. It was not an improvised camp. It was not casual. This had been planned, measured, executed with intention. The tents were high-quality expedition models, the kind used in winter mountaineering under extreme conditions. But there were no ski tracks leading away from the site. No one was visible. Only 7 tents surrounding the thermal formation, as if they were part of some kind of ritual arrangement. Foster and I exchanged a look. He activated his radio and reported our position and what we were seeing. Dispatch responded and told us to proceed with caution. We skied down into the basin and approached the first tent. I called out, identifying us as park rangers, and asked whoever was inside to come out and speak with us. There was no response. I unzipped the entrance and looked inside. Empty. There was no sleeping bag, no gear, only elk bones. Hundreds of elk bones arranged in geometric patterns across the floor of the tent. Skulls positioned at the cardinal points. Ribs laid out in spiral formations. Vertebrae stacked in precise towers. We checked the second tent. More bones. These were deer bones, mixed with what appeared to be coyote skulls. The third tent contained only bird bones, thousands of them, sorted by size and type. Each tent was a bone repository, organized with sickening meticulousness. But it was what stood at the center of the circle that froze my blood. A deer skull had been mounted on a wooden post and planted directly over the boiling mud pot. The skull was decorated with painted symbols I did not recognize. Beneath it, the mud bubbled, churned and spat, occasionally throwing boiling droplets onto the snow around the perimeter. Foster found the journal in the fourth tent. It was a leather-bound notebook, filled with handwritten entries in English mixed with symbols and words in a language neither of us could identify. The note spoke of something called feeding the old breath and referred to opening the steam door. There were diagrams showing the arrangement of the tents and detailed notes about lunar cycles and patterns of thermal activity. One passage read, "The pact must be maintained every 40 years when the earth trembles. 7 shepherds return to the sacred steam. 7 offerings of bone to calm the fire below. If the ritual fails, the mountain will wake in fury." We were photographing the journal when we heard it. Chanting, low and rhythmic. It echoed from somewhere among the thermal formations. The sound seemed to rise from the steam vents themselves, lifting with that sulfur-laden cloud. Foster and I moved toward the sound, following a narrow path between pools of boiling water. The chanting grew louder. Then we saw them. 7 figures emerged from the steam like apparitions materializing in the mist. They wore elk hides over their shoulders. The animals' heads were still attached, creating grotesque hoods. Their faces were painted with white ash in patterns that mimicked the thermal shapes around us. They walked in a line, each carrying a bundle of bones. The figure at the front was a tall, gaunt woman with eyes that seemed too large for her face. She stopped when she saw us. The others stopped behind her in perfect synchronization. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the hiss of steam and the bubbling of boiling mud. Then she spoke. Her voice was clear despite the wind. "You have entered the sacred circle. You have touched the offerings. You do not understand what you have done." I told her they were in a restricted area and that camping in a backcountry zone without permits constituted a federal violation. She smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who found my words absurdly irrelevant. She said, "We are the shepherds. Our family has maintained this pact since before your government claimed this land. We come every 40 years when the earth trembles. We feed the old breath with bones from the forest. We sing the words that calm it. If we do not, the mountain will erupt. Your park, your visitors, your cities built near the caldera, everything will burn." Foster asked who they were and where they came from. The woman tilted her head. "We have no names you would recognize. We are descendants of those who lived here before the roads and the lodges. We are guardians of knowledge your science does not possess. The thermal formations are not only geology, they are doors, thresholds, and every 40 years they open a little wider. We perform the ritual to keep them closed." I explained that they had to come with us to park headquarters, that we could sort everything out there, but that they could not remain in a closed area. The woman's expression hardened. "If you remove us before the ritual is complete, you will condemn everyone. The seismic activity has already begun. Small tremors your instruments barely register, but we feel them. The mountain is restless. We have 2 nights of offerings left, 2 more cycles of chanting. After that, the threshold will be sealed for another 40 years. Foster requested backup over the radio. In less than an hour, 4 more rangers arrived on snowmobiles. The 7 figures did not resist when we told them they would be escorted out of the area. They surrendered peacefully, gathering their belongings from the tents and dismantling the skull monument. But they said nothing else. They moved in silence as we guided them back to the trailhead. When we arrived at the ranger station, we attempted to process them. They refused to provide legal names. They had no identification, no driver's licenses, no credit cards, nothing. When asked for their names, each of them answered only Shepherd, followed by a number. Shepherd 1, Shepherd 2, all the way to Shepherd 7. We held them for 72 hours while we tried to identify them through fingerprints and facial recognition. Nothing came up. No criminal records. No missing person reports. No match in any database. It was as if they did not officially exist anywhere. The federal prosecutor reviewed the case and determined there was not enough evidence to file charges beyond trespassing or illegal entry, which was a misdemeanor. Without identification and without prior records, they were released with citations and warnings. That night, they disappeared from the county jail detention area. The cell was locked from the outside. It had no windows. There was no exit except through a door that required keycard access. But when the guard made the morning check, all 7 were gone. The security cameras showed them sitting in the cell at 2:47 in the morning. At 2:48, the image filled with static. At 2:49, the feed returned. The cell was empty. No one entered. No one left. They simply stopped being there. I tried to forget it. I told myself they had escaped by some method we had not detected and fled the area. But then I started researching geological records. I found a pattern. Every 40 years since 1872, the year Yellowstone became a national park, there has been a significant seismic event within 6 months after February. In 1912, a magnitude 4.5 earthquake near Norris. In 1952, a magnitude 5.3 earthquake that damaged park infrastructure. In 1992, a swarm of more than 1,000 small earthquakes in the same region. We arrested the shepherds in February 2019 before they could complete their ritual. In August 2019, a magnitude 4.8 earthquake struck Yellowstone, with its epicenter near Norris Basin. It was the largest earthquake recorded in the park in more than a decade. The thermal formations changed overnight. New geysers appeared. Old ones went dormant. A mud pot that had remained stable for years suddenly expanded to 3 times its size, forcing the closure of a popular boardwalk. I no longer sleep well. I tell myself it is a coincidence. That seismic activity in a volcanic caldera is normal and unpredictable. That no ritual could influence geological forces. But I cannot stop thinking about what that woman said. That every 40 years the threshold opens a little wider. The next cycle will be in 2059. By then I will be retired or dead. But someone will be patrolling that basin in February of that year. And I wonder if they will find 7 tents arranged in a circle and 7 people covered in elk hides performing a ritual our science cannot explain. And I wonder what will happen if we stop them again. Story 4. I have a degree in wilderness search and rescue from the University of Montana. I understand statistics, probability models, and patterns of human behavior in crisis situations. I have studied case files from hundreds of disappearances that occurred in national parks. I know that most of these cases follow predictable patterns. People get lost when they leave marked trails. They die from exposure when sudden weather changes catch them unprepared. They fall from cliffs while trying to take photographs. They drown in rivers swollen by snowmelt. The human body is fragile, and the wilderness does not forgive. But almost every disappearance can be explained through a rational analysis of environmental factors and errors in decision-making. What happened to the family at Shoshone Lake in July of 2018 does not fit any model I have studied. It does not match any pattern recorded in the literature. It remains the only case in my 8-year career that I cannot explain. My name is Bell. I work as a search and rescue coordinator in Yellowstone National Park. When someone fails to return from a trip into the park's backcountry, I am the person who organizes the search teams, coordinates helicopter reconnaissance, manages the incident command structure, and eventually makes the decision about when to suspend the active search. It is a responsibility I do not take lightly. Every missing person is someone's family member, and I have had to sit with enough devastated relatives to understand the weight of those decisions. But this case haunts me in a way different from all the others, because we never found a single trace of what happened. There were no bodies. There was no evidence of a crime. There was no logical explanation. Only a family that stopped existing in a place where disappearing should have been impossible. The family's last name was Whitmore. Robert and Jennifer, both 38 years old, and their 2 children, Emma, age 10, and Lucas, age 7. They were experienced backpackers from Oregon who had obtained a permit for a 3-day, 2-night trip around Shoshone Lake, one of the largest backcountry lakes in the park. Their itinerary was detailed and professional. They had listed their campsites, the expected mileage for each day, and emergency contact information. Robert was a doctor. Jennifer was a high school biology teacher. Their gear list showed that they were well prepared. They carried proper equipment, bear canisters, a water filtration system, first aid supplies, and satellite communication devices. They checked in at the ranger station on July 14th at 9 in the morning, received the briefing for their permit, and began the hike. They were supposed to return on July 16th at 4 in the afternoon. When they had not returned by 6 in the evening on the 16th, their emergency contact, Jennifer's sister, called the park. Sometimes hikers are delayed because they move more slowly than expected, or because they are enjoying the route and lose track of time. Usually we allow a buffer before activating search protocols, but by 8 that night, with no sign of the family, I was notified and began assembling a rapid response team. We deployed at first light on July 17th. I led a 4-person team directly toward their last known campsite at the southern end of Shoshone Lake, approximately 8 miles from the trailhead. We reached the site at 10:30 in the morning. What we found made no sense. The campsite was completely intact. The tent was properly pitched and staked down. Inside were 4 sleeping bags spread out and open, as if their occupants had gotten up normally in the morning. 4 pairs of hiking boots were carefully lined up outside the entrance of the tent. The bear canister was properly hanging from the food pole and was still full of the remaining supplies. The camp chairs were arranged around a cold fire ring. A water filter rested beside a pot near the shore of the lake. Everything suggested that a family had simply walked away from the campsite for a short hike, intending to return. But there were unsettling details. On the campsite picnic table, we found 2 driver's licenses and 4 park entrance cards, carefully stacked. Beside them were the 2 wedding rings, Jennifer's engagement ring, and a child's plastic friendship bracelet, all placed in a precise line. That was not normal behavior. People do not remove their identification and jewelry to arrange them geometrically before going for a walk. Beneath the identification cards was a handwritten note on a page torn from a journal. Handwriting analysis would later confirm that the writing belonged to Jennifer. The note contained a single sentence: "We heard the call. We are going below." I immediately radioed for more search resources. We expanded the perimeter and began systematic grid search patterns around the campsite. We searched along the shoreline in both directions. We checked the forest. We tried to find any sign of the family. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, torn clothing, anything. About 50 feet from the campsite was a thermal pool. It is a small formation, perhaps 8 feet in diameter, with water measured at 180 degrees Fahrenheit and an acidity level high enough to dissolve organic material. We examined it carefully but found no disturbance in the mineral deposits around the rim. There were no footprints, no indication that anyone had approached it. On the second day of the search, we brought in cadaver dogs. These dogs are trained to detect human remains and can alert to scent even if a body is submerged or buried. Both dogs showed interest in the thermal pool, but refused to approach the water. They walked to within about 10 feet, then sat down and whimpered. Their handlers described the behavior as unusual, as if the animals sensed something but were afraid to move closer. We requested support from a dive team to search the pool, but the request was denied for safety reasons. The temperature and acidity of the water make diving there impossible. Any diver who entered that pool would suffer catastrophic injuries in a matter of seconds. On the third day, a geological survey team arrived with ground-penetrating radar. They wanted to map the thermal pool to understand its structure. What they discovered was extraordinary and terrifying. The pool connected to an unexplored cave system. The radar showed a vertical shaft descending approximately 40 feet beneath the visible pool, then branching into several horizontal passages extending in different directions. One of those passages ran about 4 miles to the northeast before the radar signal weakened and they lost definition. The cave system was flooded with the same acidic, superheated water as the surface pool. It was completely inaccessible. No human being could survive entering it, and no robotic equipment available to us could function in those conditions. The search expanded to 40 square miles over 9 days. We deployed helicopter reconnaissance with thermal imaging. More than 60 people combed the area. We checked every trail, every drainage, every meadow within a reasonable distance of the campsite. We found nothing. No clothing. No gear they might have carried. Not a single sign that 4 people had passed through the forest. It was as if they had disappeared from the campsite itself without taking a single step. I interviewed other campers who had been in the area during that period. A couple camping 2 miles north reported hearing unusual sounds on the night of July 15th. They described them as a low hum or vibration that seemed to come from beneath the earth. It lasted several hours, beginning around midnight. They said it caused them nausea and disorientation. Another solo hiker reported seeing lights near Shoshone Lake that same night. They were not flashlights or campfires, but a blue-green glow that seemed to emanate from the lake itself or from beneath it. He said he watched it for about 10 minutes before it faded. Both reports were recorded, but neither appeared to be directly connected to the disappearance of the Whitmore family. We officially suspended the active search on July 25th, after exhausting all reasonable search areas and methods. The case was classified as a missing persons investigation, with suspicion of foul play ruled out due to lack of evidence. The FBI assumed jurisdiction and conducted its own investigation. They found nothing we had not already documented. The case remains open but inactive. The Whitmore family is still listed as missing. Their vehicle was towed from the trailhead parking lot and eventually returned to their relatives. Their house in Oregon remains as they left it, full of vacation plans and summer calendars that would never be fulfilled. I have directed 47 search and rescue operations in my 8 years with the Park Service. I have found lost hikers after days of searching. I have recovered remains from cliff falls and drownings. I have solved disappearances that initially seemed mysterious, but eventually had ordinary explanations. But the Whitmore family simply disappeared. 4 people, including 2 children, vanished without a trace from a campsite that showed no signs of struggle, no evidence of an animal attack, and no indication of anything except a deliberate decision to abandon their identities and go somewhere. The note haunts me more than anything else. We heard the call. We are going below. What call? Below where? The thermal pool is the only formation near that campsite that descends below ground level. But no one could enter that pool and survive. And yet the cadaver dogs indicated that something was there. The geological survey revealed passages extending for miles underground. And witnesses reported strange phenomena on the same night the family disappeared. I do not believe in supernatural explanations. I am a scientist. I trust data and evidence, but I cannot explain this case using any framework I understand. Sometimes late at night when I cannot sleep, I think about that unexplored cave system beneath Shoshone Lake. I think about where those passages lead and what might exist in the superheated darkness, miles beneath the surface. I think about a family that heard something calling them, something powerful enough to make them remove their wedding rings and leave their identities behind in order to answer it. And I think about the fact that we will never know what happened to them, because the only place they could have gone is a place no living person can follow them. Story 5. When you sign up for service as a winter ranger in the remote backcountry of the park, they tell you about the physical dangers. They warn you about cold capable of freezing exposed skin in 3 minutes, about avalanches that can bury entire valleys beneath tons of snow, about grizzly bears waking from hibernation hungry and furious, about the distance separating you from any medical center, any backup, any kind of help if something goes wrong. They explain hypothermia protocols and emergency extraction procedures. They check your equipment 3 times and make you demonstrate that you know how to operate a satellite communicator. They warn you about wildlife, weather, and isolation. But they do not tell you what 87 days of absolute solitude can do to your mind. They do not mention that the greatest threat you may face might not come from the nature surrounding you, but from something that happens inside your own head when you are completely and totally alone for 3 straight months. My name is Hayden. I have been a backcountry ranger in Yellowstone National Park for 9 years. I have completed several winter assignments at remote stations where a person can go weeks without seeing another human being. I thought I understood isolation. I believed I was prepared. In December of 2020, I volunteered for a winter post at the Thoroughfare Patrol Cabin, located in the most remote section of the park. The cabin is 32 miles from the nearest road. In summer, it can only be reached by horse, and in winter, only by skis. Snowmobiles are not allowed because of the wilderness designation. Helicopters are used only in emergencies. Once you are assigned there, you are truly cut off from everything. The assignment lasts from December 1st until mid-February, 87 days. You are resupplied once in early January when another ranger skis in with food and fuel. Other than that, you are alone. The cabin itself is small. A single room with a wood-burning stove, a bunk, a table, and basic supplies. There are shelves with books left behind by previous rangers. A radio connects to park headquarters for scheduled check-ins twice a week. Solar panels charge a battery system that provides minimal electricity. Your duties are simple. Monitor wildlife. Document weather conditions. Watch for possible poaching activity. Maintain the cabin. And survive. I arrived on December 3rd after an exhausting 2-day ski journey, carrying a pack that weighed more than 80 pounds. The ranger I was replacing looked exhausted. He helped me unload the gear, gave me a quick tour of the cabin systems, and left in less than an hour. He barely spoke. I asked him if he had any advice for the winter ahead of me. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes and said only, "Don't go outside at night unless you absolutely have to, and don't trust what you hear." The first month was manageable. I fell into a routine. Wake at dawn, feed the fire, melt snow for water, eat breakfast, ski a patrol route, return to the cabin, log observations, read, cook dinner, and sleep. The days were short. Sunrise came around 8 in the morning, and the sunset around 4:30 in the afternoon. That left more than 15 hours of darkness every day. The silence was profound. There were no traffic sounds, no airplanes, no human voices, only the wind through the pines and every now and then the distant howl of a wolf pack. I had brought books and a journal. I wrote extensively about what I saw during my patrols. Elk herds moving through the valleys, wolf tracks in the snow, steam from thermal formations creating ice crystals that hung in the air like diamonds. But in the 6th week, things began to change. I started hearing footsteps outside the cabin at night. They were clear sounds of boots crunching over snow, walking around the perimeter of the cabin in slow, deliberate circles. The first time it happened, I assumed it was an elk or a moose. Large animals sometimes approach buildings in winter, looking for shelter from the wind. But when I looked outside the next morning, there were no tracks. The snow around the cabin was clean and untouched. I told myself I had imagined it, that the wind had produced sounds my brain interpreted as footsteps. The footsteps returned 3 nights later. This time I was certain someone was walking around the cabin. I could hear each step clearly, the weight, the rhythm. I grabbed my flashlight and my bear spray and opened the door. Nothing. There was no one there. I aimed the light in every direction. Empty forest. The fresh snow that had fallen that afternoon showed no tracks near the cabin, except the path I had left myself when returning from patrol. I stood in the doorway for 10 minutes listening. Absolute silence. I went back inside and locked the door, even though locks mean very little in a place that remote. Who was I trying to keep out? By the 8th week, I began seeing something at the edge of the tree line. A motionless figure standing about 50 yards from the cabin. I would notice it at dusk, just as the light began to fade. A dark shape among the trees, too tall to be a stump, too still to be an animal. I watched it from the window. It never moved. After several minutes, I would look away to grab the binoculars or feed the fire. When I looked back, the figure was gone. Or sometimes it was closer, still motionless, still watching. One afternoon, I convinced myself to go outside and investigate. I put on my coat and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and walked toward the spot where the figure had been standing. There was nothing. No tracks. No broken branches. No sign that anyone or anything had been there. The knocking began in the 9th week. 3 deliberate knocks on the wall of the cabin, always at 2:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I woke instantly and looked at the clock. The knocks were loud enough to wake me, but not aggressive. Just 3 measured impacts against the exterior wall on the east side of the cabin. Knock, knock, knock. Then silence. I would lie there in the bunk listening, but the knocks never repeated. In the morning, I would go outside to examine the wall. There were no marks, no sign that anything had struck the wood. I tried to rationalize it. Thermal expansion of the logs caused by temperature changes, ice falling from the roof, branches moving in the wind. But none of those explanations fit the consistency and precision of what I heard, and the time was always exactly the same. 2:47 in the morning to the minute every time. In the 10th week, I found my ranger uniform hanging from a branch 100 yards from the cabin. I discovered it during the morning patrol. My official shirt and pants were hanging carefully, as if they had been placed on a hanger inside a closet, swaying gently in the breeze. That was impossible. I was wearing my only uniform. I checked when I returned to the cabin. My uniform was in my pack where I always kept it. I had not taken it out. I had not hung anything from any tree. And yet there it was, an identical uniform, the same size, the same wear marks, hanging in the forest as if someone had placed it there knowing exactly where I was going to walk. During my next scheduled check-in, I radioed headquarters. I tried to explain what was happening without sounding insane. The ranger who answered suggested that maybe I was experiencing stress and asked if I wanted an early extraction. I said no. I had committed to 87 days, and I would complete the assignment. But I asked if there was any history of strange incidents at that cabin. There was a long pause. Then the ranger said some winter assignments had ended early because of personnel wellness concerns, but he could not discuss details. He reminded me that isolation affects everyone differently and that requesting extraction was not considered a failure. I stopped sleeping through full nights. I dozed in short intervals but woke frequently. The 11th week brought something new. I woke at dawn and realized I was outside, not near the cabin, not on the porch. I was 200 yards away, in the forest, standing in 2 feet of snow, wearing only thermal underwear. My feet were bare. The temperature was 15 degrees below zero. My feet were already numb and beginning to turn white. I ran back to the cabin, stumbling and falling. I got inside and spent an hour warming my feet in lukewarm water to prevent frostbite. When feeling returned, the pain was extraordinary. But worse than the pain was understanding that I had walked outside in my sleep with no memory of doing it. I could have died. If I had walked farther, or if the temperature had been lower, I would have died. Later that morning, I went outside to examine my tracks. They formed a perfect circle around the cabin. I had walked in a circle 23 times, each lap following exactly the same path. The footprints were evenly spaced, mechanical, not like the wandering route of someone confused or disoriented. I had walked with purpose, repeating the same pattern again and again, before finally stopping in the forest. I also found something else. My journal was on a rocky outcrop 50 feet from where I had stopped. The same journal I kept inside the cabin. I picked it up and opened it to the last entry. Beneath my final notes from the previous day, there was new writing. My handwriting. Words I did not remember writing. I am not alone. I have never been alone. Now there are 7 of me. I requested emergency extraction by radio. I told headquarters I needed to be removed from the station immediately. The ranger asked if I was experiencing a medical emergency. I answered that I was not sure, but that I could not stay there any longer. He told me the soonest they could arrange a helicopter extraction was in 3 days due to weather conditions and availability. I had to wait. I barricaded myself inside the cabin. I did not go outside except to bring in firewood. I did not sleep. I sat at the table with my knife and bear spray, counting the hours. The figure appeared in the window on the second night, not at the tree line, at the window. A face pressed against the glass, looking in. My face, my exact same features, watching me from outside. I screamed and ran to the door. When I opened it, there was nothing. But in the snow beneath the window, there were footprints. Boot prints identical to mine. The pattern matched my boots exactly. The tracks led away from the cabin in a straight line and then stopped after 20 feet. They simply stopped. Like those mysterious tracks Quinn had seen in Thoroughfare. Like everything inexplicable in that place, they ended without resolution. The helicopter arrived on the morning of the 3rd day. The pilot said I looked bad, that I seemed to have aged 10 years. I was 34, but he said I looked 44. I saw my reflection in the helicopter window. He was right. My hair had turned gray at the temples. I had deep lines around my eyes that had not been there 11 weeks earlier. The park psychologist performed an evaluation. It was standard protocol for an early extraction. She found no evidence of mental illness, no psychotic symptoms, and no hallucinations that matched diagnostic criteria. Only an extreme stress response, consistent with prolonged isolation in a hostile environment. She asked if I would ever accept remote winter assignments again. I said no. She noted it in my file and cleared me to return to my normal duties. They wanted to send another ranger to the Thoroughfare cabin to complete the winter season. I told my supervisor he should burn the cabin to the ground, that it was not safe, that something in that place was wrong in a way I could not articulate. He looked at me with compassion, but he did not take my recommendations seriously. 2 weeks later, they sent a ranger named Marcus to finish the winter assignment. He lasted 12 days before requesting extraction. He refused to explain why. He filed a report that remains classified. I ran into him 6 months later at a training session. He would not look me in the eye. When I asked what had happened at the cabin, he walked away without saying a word. I still work for Yellowstone. I do summer patrols in areas full of tourists, where I interact with hundreds of people every day. I will never again do isolated work in the remote backcountry of the park, and I will never return to Thoroughfare. Whatever exists in that distant corner of the park, whether it comes from the land itself or from something that happens to the human mind when it is pushed too far into solitude, it should be left alone. Some places are not meant for human beings to inhabit during the dark months of winter. Some silences should not be broken, and some questions about what we see and hear deep in the wilderness should never be answered. Story 6. I need to tell someone this before it happens again, and I know it will happen again. because he is still out there and the FBI has not been able to find him. My name is Piper. I have been a law enforcement ranger in Yellowstone National Park for 7 years. I have dealt with drunk tourists, poachers, drug trafficking through the park, domestic violence incidents at campsites, and one homicide investigation. I thought I had already seen the worst of human behavior in a wilderness setting, but nothing prepared me for the case that began in August of 2022, and to this day remains unresolved. Nothing prepared me to understand that someone had been watching women sleep inside their tents for years, photographing them, visiting them, and we had no idea until it was almost too late. The first report came in on August 7th. A woman named Sarah Martinez had been hiking solo on the Cascade Lake Trail. She was 31 years old, an experienced hiker from Colorado, and had obtained a permit to spend 3 nights in the park's backcountry. She completed her trip without incident, returned to her vehicle at the trailhead, and was preparing to leave the park when she noticed something tucked beneath her windshield wiper. It was not a parking ticket. It was not an advertisement. It was a photograph of herself sleeping inside her tent, taken from inside the tent, from above looking down at her face on the pillow. She brought it immediately to the ranger station. I was the one who took her statement. Sarah was visibly shaken. The photograph was a standard 4x6 print on glossy paper, the kind you can get from any photo development service. It showed Sarah inside her sleeping bag, eyes closed, completely unaware that someone was standing over her with a camera. The angle suggested that the photographer had been crouched or kneeling beside her. The tent fabric was visible in the frame, confirming that the image had been taken from inside the tent while she slept. On the back of the photograph, written in black marker in careful block letters, was a single word: visited. I asked Sarah if she had heard anything strange during the night she camped. She said no. She was a light sleeper and always woke up when an animal came near camp, but she had not heard anyone enter her tent. I asked if she had noticed anyone following her on the trail or camping nearby. Again, the answer was no. She had seen other hikers during the day, but no one suspicious. Her campsite had been at a designated location along the eastern shore of Cascade Lake. It was a popular area during a peak season. I filed an incident report and opened an investigation, but I told Sarah honestly that, without more evidence or information about the suspect, there was little we could do besides increase patrol presence on that trail. 3 days later, another woman filed a similar report, then another. Over the next 2 weeks, 5 women came forward with identical stories. All of them were solo hikers. All of them had completed multi-day backcountry trips on different Yellowstone trails. All of them had found photographs of themselves sleeping inside their tents, left on their vehicles when they returned. Each photograph had been taken from inside the tent. Each image showed the woman asleep and vulnerable, and all of them had the same word written on the back: visited. This was no longer an isolated incident. It was a pattern. Someone was systematically targeting women who camped alone in remote areas. He was entering their tents while they slept, photographing them up close, and then tracking their vehicles to leave the images where they would find them. The level of skill required was disturbing. Entering a tent without waking the person sleeping inside requires extreme care. Doing it repeatedly without being detected suggested someone who moved through the wilderness with professional competence. And tracking the vehicles meant he was watching the trailheads, noting license plates and parking locations. I coordinated with FBI agents who have jurisdiction over major crimes in national parks. They reviewed all 5 cases and determined that we were dealing with a serial stalker who represented an escalating threat. The current behavior was surveillance without physical contact, but the psychological profile suggested that he could eventually progress to physical assault. They approved an undercover operation. I volunteered to act as bait. On August 23rd, I obtained a backcountry camping permit under a false name. I parked a rental vehicle at the Cascade Lake trailhead and hiked alone into the backcountry, carrying minimal gear but wearing a hidden body camera and a GPS tracker. I also carried my service weapon and bear spray. 2 backup rangers positioned themselves at a campsite 1 mile away, monitoring my GPS signal and ready to respond in under 10 minutes if I activated the panic button. I set up camp at one of the designated sites where previous incidents had occurred, pitched my tent, ate dinner, and pretended to prepare for sleep. I did not sleep. I lay inside my sleeping bag, fully dressed, with my hand on my weapon and my eyes barely closed. The body camera was positioned to record anyone who entered the tent. Hours passed. Midnight. 1 in the morning. 2 in the morning. I was starting to think he would not come when I heard it. The faintest sound of a tent zipper slowly opening. I kept my eyes closed but tightened my hand around my weapon. I could hear breathing. Someone was inside my tent. I could feel the presence of another person kneeling beside me. Then came the faint click of a camera shutter. I opened my eyes and sat up in a single movement, drawing my weapon and activating the panic button at the same time. Federal agent, do not move. The figure lunged backward, tore through the tent entrance, and disappeared into the darkness. I went after him, flashlight in one hand and weapon in the other. I caught sight of a man running toward the forest. I pursued him for about 50 yards before losing him among the dense trees. My backup arrived in 8 minutes. We conducted an immediate search of the area, but he had vanished. However, the body camera had captured his face. When we reviewed the footage, I recognized him immediately. He was a search and rescue volunteer who had worked with the Park Service for 3 years. He had participated in training exercises. He had access to backcountry permits and trailhead information. He had legitimate reasons to be in the park at any hour. His name was Michael Brennan, 36 years old, no criminal record. He lived in a town 40 miles from the park and worked as a wilderness guide for a private tour company. The recording captured something else before he realized I was awake. He had placed an object on the floor beside my sleeping bag. We recovered it during the search. It was a binder, a 3-ring binder with plastic sheet protectors. And inside those protectors were photographs. More than 200 photographs of women sleeping inside tents. I recognized some from the recent reports, but most were women I had never seen. Based on the clothing and gear visible in the images, the photos appeared to span several years. Some had handwritten notes on the back, with dates and locations. Some had names. Others only had the word, visited. We issued a warrant for Brennan's arrest. Federal agents went to his house the next morning. He was gone. So was his vehicle. He had packed up and fled sometime during the night after the confrontation. The search of his residence uncovered more evidence. A detailed map of Yellowstone and the surrounding national forests, with campsites marked. A database on his computer listing women's names, physical descriptions, hiking itineraries he had somehow obtained, and notes about their camping habits. They also found photo development equipment and climbing gear that would have allowed him to move silently through the forest. The manhunt lasted 6 days. They tracked him through credit card use and traffic cameras. He always stayed one step ahead, moving along back roads and through wilderness areas. On the 6th day, they located his abandoned vehicle at a trailhead in Bridger Teton National Forest. He had entered the backcountry on foot. Search teams combed the area for another week. They found no trace of him. Michael Brennan disappeared into the same wilderness he knew so well. That was 2 years ago. He has never been found. But every few months, another woman in another park somewhere in the western United States reports finding a photograph of herself sleeping in her tent. different parks, different states: Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, Oregon, Washington. The photographs always have the same format. They are always taken from inside the tent. They always have the word "visited" written on the back in the same block letters. Sometimes there are dates. Sometimes there are new notes. One woman found a photograph with the message, "You looked peaceful. I almost did not want to leave." The FBI has him on its most wanted list for federal stalking charges. His photograph has been distributed to every national park and Forest Service office in the country. But he is still out there, still watching, still visiting, still photographing women while they sleep. And I carry the weight of knowing that we had him and lost him, that the operation I led pushed him further underground and may have made him more dangerous. I no longer camp alone. None of the female rangers in our district do. We travel in pairs during a backcountry patrols. We check each other's tents before sleeping. We take turns staying awake during overnight assignments, because we know he could be anyone. A volunteer, a camper with a permit, another hiker passing by on the trail, someone who seems friendly, helpful, and trustworthy during the day, and then at night becomes someone else. Someone who moves like a ghost in the dark, entering tents without making a sound, standing over sleeping women, taking their photographs, and disappearing before dawn. If you are a woman who camps alone in remote areas, please be careful. Secure your tent zippers with clips. Place noise-making objects, like bells or a bag of gravel, near the entrance. Sleep with bear spray within reach. And if you ever find a photograph of yourself sleeping, left somewhere you know you will discover it, contact the authorities immediately, because Michael Brennan is still out there, and the FBI believes he will not stop until he is captured, or until he escalates to something worse than photographs. I think about those 200 women whose images were in his binder. How many of them never knew they had been visited? How many walked out of the wilderness with no idea that someone had been inside their tent, watching them breathe? And I think about the women he has visited since then, the ones who will find their photographs days or weeks later and understand that while they slept completely vulnerable and alone, a stranger was standing over them in the dark. Story 7. My grandfather was one of the first rangers at Yellowstone National Park in 1946. He was hired as part of the post-war expansion when veterans were returning home and the Park Service was rebuilding its staff after years of shortages during the war. His name was Robert Spencer Holt. He worked at Yellowstone for 37 years before retiring in 1983, 3 years before I was born. I never knew him while he was alive. He died when my father was still young. Everything I knew about him came from old photographs and the stories my father told me. Stories about a man who loved the wilderness above all else. Someone who dedicated his entire adult life to protecting a landscape he considered sacred. But in September of 2021, I met him anyway on the trail to Lone Star Geyser. And what he showed me completely changed everything I thought I understood about death and about the land we have sworn to protect. My name is Spencer. I was named after my grandfather. I carry his middle name as my first, a family tradition meant to honor the man who had set the path I would eventually follow. I joined the National Park Service when I was 24 years old. I specifically requested assignment to Yellowstone because I wanted to walk the same trails he had walked, see the same geysers he had watched over, and understand what had called him so strongly that he dedicated his entire existence to this place. I have been a ranger here for 6 years. I know the park well. I know its trails, its wildlife patterns, its thermal formations, and its dangers. I thought I knew everything important there was to know about Yellowstone. I was wrong. The incident occurred on September 17th, 2021. I was conducting a routine patrol on the trail to Lone Star Geyser, a popular but moderately demanding hike that follows the Firehole River for about 2.5 miles into the park's interior. It was a clear afternoon with temperatures just above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Perfect hiking weather. The trail was busy with day hikers, and I had stopped several times to answer questions about wildlife and thermal formations. Around 3 in the afternoon, as I approached the geyser, I noticed a man farther ahead on the trail. He was wearing a ranger uniform, but not the current style. It was the old design from the 1940s and 1950s. Dark green wool and a wide-brimmed campaign hat. The kind of uniform you see in historical photographs, but that is no longer used in practice. I assumed he was someone dressed for a historical reenactment or some educational program. The park sometimes organizes living history events where volunteers wear period clothing. I quickened my pace to catch up with him, intending to ask what program he was participating in. He turned as I approached and waved at me, a friendly, casual gesture. Then he kept walking. I called out to him, "Excuse me, sir." He did not respond. He simply maintained his pace, following the trail deeper into the forest. I followed him, now driven by curiosity. The path to Lone Star Geyser is well defined and direct, but he turned onto a side trail I had never noticed before. It was a faint game path cutting through dense lodgepole pines toward what appeared to be a small meadow. I hesitated. Rangers do not leave marked trails during patrol unless there is a specific reason, an emergency, or a report of illegal activity. But something compelled me to follow him. I cannot explain it rationally. It felt necessary. I stepped off the main trail and followed the man in the old uniform into the forest. The path was narrow and overgrown. Branches scraped my pack. The ground was soft, covered with pine needles and moss. After about 200 yards, the trees opened into a small meadow I had never seen before, despite having patrolled that area dozens of times. The man stood in the center of the clearing, with his back to me. He pointed at the ground at his feet and spoke for the first time. His voice was clear but somehow distant, as if it were coming from much farther away than the place where he stood. He said, "This is where it happened." I stepped closer and asked, "Where? What happened?" Then he turned to look at me. I saw his face clearly for the first time, and I recognized him. I recognized him from the photographs I had seen throughout my entire childhood. The same strong jaw, the same sunken eyes, the same expression of quiet authority. It was my grandfather, Robert Spencer Holt, a man who had been dead for 38 years. I should have run. I should have felt terror. But I did not. The only thing I felt was a deep sense of peace and curiosity. He watched me for a long moment and then said, "You will understand when you dig." I asked him what I should look for. He only smiled, a sad, kind smile, and he said, "You will know." Then he turned and walked toward the tree line. I watched him go. He moved with that same deliberate, measured stride. Then he simply disappeared. He did not slowly fade away. He did not become transparent. He stepped into the shadows beneath the pines and stopped existing between one step and the next. I stood in the meadow for several minutes trying to process what I had just witnessed. A hallucination seemed like the most rational explanation, but I felt completely lucid. I was not tired. I was not dehydrated. I had not hit my head. I was simply there in a meadow where my dead grandfather had appeared to me, spoken to me, and then disappeared. I looked at the spot on the ground where he had stood and pointed. The earth looked normal. Grass, wildflowers, and moss. Nothing out of the ordinary. But I carefully marked the location using terrain references and GPS coordinates. Then I returned to the main trail and continued my patrol in a kind of daze. I did not report what had happened. How could I have? What was I going to say? That I had seen a ghost? That the spirit of my grandfather had led me off the trail to show me something? They would have sent me for a psychiatric evaluation. They would have pulled me from duty. So I said nothing, but I could not stop thinking about it. That night I reviewed historical records about my grandfather's career. I read his personnel files, available to family members through the Park Service archives. I found references to patrols he had conducted, places where he had been assigned, and incidents he had responded to. One entry from 1951 caught my attention. My grandfather had reported the theft of his official ranger badge during a backcountry patrol. The badge was never recovered. He was issued a replacement, and the theft was recorded in his file, but it was never solved. The place where he reported the theft was listed as the Lone Star Geyser area. The date was September 19, 1951, exactly 2 days before 70 years had passed since that theft. I decided I had to return to the meadow. I requested a day off and returned on September 20th with a shovel, a metal detector, and ground-penetrating radar equipment I borrowed under the pretense of conducting a geological survey. I found the meadow again without difficulty. The GPS coordinates I had marked took me directly there. I began scanning the area with the metal detector. Within minutes, I got a strong signal right at the exact spot where my grandfather had been standing. I started digging. The soil was soft and came away easily. At about 3 feet down, I hit something solid. I carefully cleared away the dirt and found a metal object wrapped in waxed cloth. I pulled it out and unwrapped it. Inside was a ranger badge, an original National Park Service badge from the 1940s. The kind my grandfather would have worn. I turned it over. Engraved on the back was his full name, Robert Spencer Holt. Beneath the badge was a piece of paper, also wrapped in waxed cloth to protect it from moisture. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the handwriting was clear. The note read, "To my grandson when he follows the same path. You will find this when I need you to know that I am still watching over the park. Some rangers never leave. We only change the way we serve. Carry this with you. It will remind you that this land is more than geology and biology. It is memory. It is continuity. It is sacred. Protect it as I did." Signed, Robert Spencer Holt, September 19th, 1982. The date took my breath away. September 19th, 1982. 1 year before my grandfather died. 31 years before I was hired as a ranger. He had buried that badge and that note in a meadow off the trail to Lone Star Geyser with the certainty that someday, somehow, I would find it. He could not have known I would become a ranger. I had not even been born. But he knew, or he hoped, and he left that message for me. I contacted my father and asked if he knew anything about that meadow or whether my grandfather had buried something there. My father was stunned. He told me that in the year before his death, my grandfather had requested that his ashes be scattered in a specific place in Yellowstone. He had given the family exact coordinates. My father looked them up. The coordinates matched the meadow where I had found the badge. My grandfather's ashes were scattered there in October of 1983, exactly as he had requested. He had chosen the same exact spot where 1 year earlier he had buried his badge and a note for a grandson who did not yet exist. Somehow he had known I would be drawn to that place, that I would follow the same calling he had followed, that I would need to know he was still present in the landscape he loved. Now I carry that badge on every patrol. I keep it in my breast pocket close to my heart, and sometimes at dusk when the light begins to fade and I walk the trails alone, I see that figure in the old uniform at the edges of meadows or standing beside thermal formations. Always at a distance, always watching. He never approaches. He never speaks again. He simply remains there, a silent presence, guarding his park. I understand now what he was trying to tell me. Some rangers never truly leave Yellowstone. We become part of it. Our presence seeps into the soil, into the steam, and into the stone. We patrol these trails long after our bodies have turned to ash and been scattered by the wind. And to those who come after, those who carry the same dedication and the same love for this sacred landscape, we remain visible, not as ghosts, not as cursed apparitions, but as echoes of a service that never fully ends. I will work in Yellowstone for as long as my body allows. And when my time comes, I will ask for my ashes to be scattered in that same meadow where my grandfather rests. Perhaps decades later, another ranger will walk these trails and see two figures in old uniforms, watching together. And they will understand that this park is more than a job. It is a calling that transcends life and death. It is a promise we make to the land and to one another, to protect, to preserve, and never fully leave.